much, everyone, for coming. Yeah, if you haven't already, please do register. Here's an even bigger QR code to make your life easier. Yeah, so I'm just really excited to be here today. I kind of vaguely had this idea in my first year. I think debates are a really good way to, friendly debates are a good way to explore arguments. And so I've kind of wanted to do something like this for a long time. But it's really difficult to organize. It's hard to convince people to come up here and defend their views in front of the department. So incredibly grateful to Sean and Ben for being our kind of first speakers. Yeah, I think that I've lost the sheet with my notes. I think that, yeah, the idea behind this is basically to have these fun, low stakes, convivial opportunities to explore different arguments from across cognitive science. There's no need for kind of personal commitment in the arguments. In fact, the sides for this debate were decided by a coin flip. And I think that's kind of all part of it. This is the idea of just exploring an argument rather than this kind of personal, defending your own views. So yeah, I'd love to do more of these and do them more frequently. So please do let me know if you'd be interested in speaking or if there's a motion that you'd like to see discussed. The motion we're discussing today is, do large language models understand language? So this is a bit of background. Most people, I'm sure, know this by now, but large language models are statistical models of language that learn to predict words in a sequence based on their surrounding linguistic context. They've rapidly improved over the last few years, and they're now able to produce kind of fluent, naturalistic text, and they are kind of at parity with humans on a variety of language-based tasks, and also psychology instruments that are designed to measure specific constructs in humans. So this raises a really interesting question as to whether LLMs actually understand the text they produce, or whether they're just kind of stochastic parrots. The speakers today, Sean Trott is an assistant professor in both the Cognitive Science and Computational Social Science departments at UCSD. He was also formerly a graduate student in Ben's lab. Sean's research investigates the role of ambiguity in language, of mentalizing ability in pragmatic inference, and more recently, the extent to which LLMs can account for human language comprehension and judgments. He also maintains a really excellent substack blog, which I'd highly recommend to anyone who's interested in this kind of topic. Ben Bergen is a professor of cognitive science at UCSD and the director of the Language and Cognition Lab. His research is focused on a wide variety of different facets of language, including the role of embodied cognition in language understanding, embodied construction grammar, computational models of human language comprehension, and his personal passions for humor and profanity. I'm really grateful to both Sean and Ben for agreeing to do this. This is a debate that we've had many times kind of informally around the lab. We both find ourselves agreeing or disagreeing with some version or other of this motion. So it made sense to assign the side by coin flip for this. I also think that's kind of a fun norm to establish for these debates, yeah, in the sense of exploring arguments rather than defending personal views. So the result of that coin flip is that Sean will be arguing the proposition case that large language models do understand language, and Ben will be arguing the opposition case. The format, we're kind of here at the 12:10 to 12:15 welcome. Then we're going to have 5-minute opening statements from each of the speakers. They'll then get 2 minutes to reply to one another. Then we'll open the floor to questions, open to the floor for questions for about 15 minutes. And so if you have a question, just stick up your hand and I'll kind of try to triage and come around to people. So try to direct, have a relatively brief question that you direct to one of the speakers. And then one or both of them will get a chance to respond. And finally, each speaker will get a closing statement, and then we'll have a closing vote to see how people's minds have been changed. So without further ado, yeah, I'd like to welcome Sean up for the first opening speech. So.
Go ahead and get started. Yeah. Okay, hi everybody. So I'm going to defend the argument that large language models understand language. So I want to start out with what's in scope. So a large language model is a neural network with billions of parameters trained to do next token prediction on billions or sometimes trillions of words. And just for the purpose of this debate, I'm going to exclude multimodal models or otherwise grounded models. Some of my results that I discuss will include models trained with fine tuning, but most of the results do not. And then secondly, what is language understanding? So I'll argue that understanding is fundamentally about meaning, which here is taken to be, first of all, distinct from qualia or consciousness. I think we need to be able to differentiate these things to have a tractable debate. Meaning is also multifaceted, so it could refer to the relationships between words. It could talk about situations and the roles of participants that have in situations, speech acts, so why someone said something, and also just about producing a contingent response to a linguistic input. Meaning is also broad enough to be compatible with multiple views, whether you are a fan of a sort of representational take on cognition or a more enacted take on cognition. And finally, meaning is graded, so you can exhibit degrees of understanding. It is possible for large language models to understand language to some extent. And then I want to talk about what my philosophical commitments will be in this debate. So understanding is something that can be observed and also empirically tested using either a system's behavior or its internal states. Secondly, the capacity of the system is not the same thing as its training objectives. So large language models are sometimes called jumped up autocomplete because what they're trained to do is sort of next token prediction. But a system trained to do next token prediction can in fact acquire other kinds of capacities in the course of that training process, because you might need really deep representations of the world, or even a plausible model of the speaker who's producing the text in order to do a good job of predicting the tokens that they are actually producing. And then finally, we assume that humans understand language. We take that as a given. And we usually do that on the basis of our interactions with them. And it's fine if we want to hold LLMs to a higher empirical standard, using tests rather than like the vibes of our interaction with them. But those standards shouldn't include measures that humans don't also pass, right? So if an LLM fails a test that's meant to measure their understanding, if humans also fail that test, it's not fair to say that therefore LLMs, but not humans, do not understand languages. Okay. So what is the evidence? So first of all, on the question of whether LLMs know what words mean, there's an old idea going back at least to the 50s or 60s, arguing that you shall know a word by the company it keeps. So you can learn a lot about the meaning of a word, arguably from the distributional patterns that it has in just a large corpus of text. And in fact, there's decades of research showing that when you build a system whose representations are extracted from co-occurrence patterns in which words co-occur with each other words, those representations correlate pretty strongly with human semantic judgments about how words are related, the concreteness of different words. And more recent work using advances in large language models suggests that these representations have only gotten much better, to the point where judgments produced by a large language model are in fact more aligned with the average human semantic judgment on many domains than individual human semantic judgments are. On the question of whether LLMs have situation models, I'm going to present two pieces of evidence, each of which in humans is taken as evidence that humans use situation models to understand language or theory of mind. So the first piece of evidence comes from Michael et al. 2023, looking at replicating basically an old study using EEG, where it shows that LLMs are both sensitive to what's called an animacy violation. So something like the peanut was in love, people would be surprised to hear that out of context. But LLMs, like humans, can dynamically update or even override or reverse their expectations based on local discourse context, right? So if a peanut is construed as human-like, people can update their expectations about whether the peanut is in love, and so too can an LLM. Also, other recent work in the lab shows that LLMs are sensitive not only to features of the situation, like where an object is or whether it's been moved, but also to people in that passage's or a story's knowledge states about whether the object has been moved, which again, in humans is taken as theory of mind. So I'd argue, as taken as evidence of theory of mind, so I'd argue that in LLMs it should be as well. On the question of whether LLMs understand speech acts, so why someone said something, a paper from 2022 shows that LLMs display, especially the largest ones, display near human level performance on a number of different pragmatic phenomena, including deceit, indirect speech, and humor. And finally, in the questions of whether they produce contingent responses, I'd argue that this is still an outstanding question. Maybe the closest comes from Jones and Bergen 2023 using the Turing test, showing that LLMs are not quite at human level, but are sort of approaching perhaps that barometer. And then finally, I want to close by talking about the question of human language understanding. Sometimes grounding is taken as a prerequisite. So having physical experience with a particular domain, there's now a large body of work showing that congenitally blind individuals build rich representations of visual concepts that in many cases are indistinguishable from the representations that sighted individuals build with that domain. Often people also take language understanding to be very deep, right? Building like these deep compositional parses. There are some suggestions. Sorry, my timer's disconnected. There's now work showing that people actually might build sort of good enough representations that don't actually necessarily take into account everything that a sentence says. And so that's something that we should also take into account when we talk about what LLMs are extracted from language. Thanks.
Very much, Sean. I'd like to welcome Ben for his opening statement.
Let's set my timer here. So suppose I teach you a new word in a language you don't speak. So for everyone here, that would, except for Marta, that would be Hungarian, for example. And I don't tell you what it means, but I ask you to predict the next Hungarian word that's going to come after it, which you don't know. And then I'll ask you to predict the next one after that, and the next one after that. And of course, you'll fail for a while. And then maybe over the course of exposure, you may learn to better predict which Hungarian word follows which other Hungarian word that you don't know the meaning of. But you still won't know what any of the words mean. Even if you do this a million times or a billion times or a trillion times, all you can do is say which words go with which other words. And that's exactly as much as a large language model can do, because like you with this Hungarian example, the LLM is just learning the probabilities of words in a language it doesn't understand. And it can't relate those words to any bodily experiences. It has no body. It can't relate them to social experiences. It has no social interactions. It has no intentions or memories of the world that it can relate those to. And these are essential for understanding. To understand requires those kinds of relations, because between language and the world, or between language and an understander's experiences with the world, depending on your theory, and the history of cognitive science has produced lots of theories that have lots of different accounts of what these relationships might be. It could be that the words relate to innate concepts that you're born with, or it could be concepts that you've gained through exposure, through experience being in the world, or maybe to communicative intent, or whatever. But LLMs have no experiences with the world, and they have no innate concepts, and they have no communicative intents. And so the language that they produce and that they process has nothing to refer to. It's unrelated to anything else outside of the language itself. It's ungrounded and it's therefore meaningless. So compare next word prediction in an LLM to what a human does. Like, what do I do when I hear a sentence like, please walk the dog, which I may hear several times a day? I know what dogs look like. I know what they sound like. I know what they smell like. And I may use these things in order to find the dog that I'm supposed to walk. I know how to move my skeletal muscles in order to attach the leash to a collar or harness. I know how to slow my body down if the dog starts to pull on the leash because there's a squirrel or a piece of trash or whatever. And this is all useful so that I can actually enact the requested action. There's decades of evidence for cognitive science showing that meaning is grounded in these ways through action, perception, emotion. And there's behavioral evidence, and there's neuroimaging evidence, and there's TMS evidence. In fact, there's even proof that we all already agree that language models don't understand language, which comes from the fact that we don't hold them accountable for the things that for the language that they produce. So if you successfully prompt an LLM to engage in libel or hate speech or incite violence, you don't blame the LLM. The LLM won't be sued or fined or jailed, because as a society and as individuals, we all already agree that the LLM doesn't understand what it's producing, or what the real world consequences could be of the language that it produces. If we did, then we would hold it responsible for the actions and not the creators or users of those devices, just like an autonomous vehicle. You hold Elon Musk responsible when a Tesla crashes, not that instantiation of the vehicle. So what do we make of the compelling evidence that Sean presented that LLMs act like they understand, this behavioral evidence that they act that way? That's actually on us. So humans are particularly poor at inferring capacity from behavior. You might have heard Cameron's talk about the Turing test at Cognition at the Shore. As Sean suggested, 41% of participants thought that GPT-4 was a human. 27% thought that Eliza was a human, the 1960s chatbot that pretends to be a therapist. In this case, we know the ground truth. We know that these are not, in fact, humans. We know that the humans are wrong in their judgments. But when faced with the new technology, humans often lean on habitual patterns of explanation, which leads them to the wrong conclusion. This is especially true as we're discovering with language. Throughout our lives, there's only one kind of thing that has ever produced human-like language in our experience, humans. And so when we're presented with similar language, we attribute human-like competence to whatever produces it. That's an attribution error that we're making, which tells us more about what we think is evidence of humanity than about the underlying competence of LLMs. LLMs are actually quite unstable in terms of their behaviors. So for example, in work with James Mikhailov, who's not down here, we found that LLMs are really good at predicting the last word of a sentence like most squirrels gather nuts. It's nuts. It's not nails. They're good at that. They're very poor if you give them a sentence like few squirrels gather. Then they still think it's nuts, not nails. Why? Because squirrels go together with gather and nail and nuts, not nails. They don't interpret the word in the way that humans do. It's a parlor trick. It's $100 billion parlor trick, but it reveals itself when it breaks down. Just like Eliza and just like clever Hans, LLMs only seem clever when you ask the right kind of question in exactly the right way. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Ben. So now Sean's going to get 2 minutes to respond to that. Totally up to you.
Okay. Okay, so thanks, Ben, for your arguments. First of all, the point that which words would go with other words is not understanding the thought experiment about Hungarian. I would argue that sort of this relies on our intuition about a situation we can't really fathom, and I don't know that we should really take thought experiments like this very seriously. I don't think we can have reasonable intuitions about what it would be like to predict Hungarian words so well as an LLM would predict them through exposure to billions and billions of examples. I think if we did have intuition about that, we might actually change our mind and think that that did constitute understand them. I think it's also important to return to the issue of gradedness. So it's true that a text-only LLM might exhibit certain kinds of instabilities or issues. I don't think that negates the question of whether an LLM understands language. It says that maybe they don't understand language in exactly the same ways or to the same extent as humans, but they do display a lot of behaviors that are consistent with understanding, and which in humans we would argue is consistent with understanding. And then that takes to the question of empirical tests. We say there's decades of like behavioral evidence that language understanding is grounded, but I would argue actually there's very little evidence that grounding is necessary for language comprehension. And in fact, much of the evidence for grounding might be able to be explained by large language models, even those exposed to text-only prediction, right? Most of it's either correlational, the evidence that it's like causal or necessary. For language comprehension specifically, I would say there's a dearth of evidence on that particular point. I'm also not sure the issue of accountability, right? The fact that we don't hold them accountable is really the right angle here, because we could just be wrong, right? In 4 to 5 years, we might have agent-based systems that are grounded using LLM technologies that that we think should actually be held accountable for the things that they do or say. I mean, that's largely a legal liability question. And that's a decision of like, what is the most efficient and practical way to distribute blame or responsibility in a legal system. But I think, as you yourself said, I don't think our intuitions about that necessarily are hold up or are the right angle to have in this question.
Okay, and now this is Ben's second reply and the last kind of talk before we move to questions.
Okay, 2 minutes, right?
Yeah.
So I agree that if you redefine understanding to mean not understanding, then the proposition holds. There is certainly a kind of thing that LLMs do. It's not the deeper kind of understanding like what humans do, but maybe it's some kind of superficial understanding. Like understanding means knowing how words fit together, but not knowing how they refer to the world and to experience, like the kind of thing that a zombie might do. Is Brad here to confirm? No. I'm willing to stipulate that if you redefine understanding to mean not really understand, then yes. But what lay people and cognitive scientists mean by understand is to relate words to subsequent actions, to the world, to their experiences. And this is definitely not what LLMs do, but don't take my word for it. There was a paper that came out last year in which the authors argued a system trained on language alone will never approximate human intelligence, even if trained from now until the heat death of the universe. That was what denier of technology would say this? Well, this was Yann LeCun, who invented convolutional neural networks and was one of the godfathers of deep learning. The final point that I would make is that you mentioned that that blind people are able to use language, and I think this is a great point. There exist many modalities in which we engage with the world, and certainly the absence of one of them does not entail that one does not have grounding ability in all of the other modalities of interaction. And that's what I have to say.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much to both Sean and Ben for getting us kicked off. So now we're going to have about 15 minutes for questions. So yeah, just feel free to stick up your hand if you have something you'd like to ask. Yeah, Raphael.
Thank you, guys. Interesting. There's one big assumption here is that language is written. In fact, written language was invented 6,000 years ago, merely. Human speech is about 200, 250,000, depending on who you ask. Language, probably, we don't know exactly, but let's say 40, 50,000 years. So in that way, written language is really like a little late happening in the human saga. So when we say, do they understand language? Is it just the written thing, or is it more than that when you're looking at it when you talk about human language, other forms of cues or whatever, gesture and so on? So, thoughts? Why is it reduced to just written, the whole debate?
Well, I don't think the debate is reduced. I mean, these actual tools do use written language. That's true. But there are lots of implementations that attach speech synthesis and speech recognition to them. Certainly that. I mean, that is, you wouldn't have to involve only one modality. I mean, I noticed that obviously there are no LLMs for sign languages either. That's a problematic fact based on just the absence of corpora for the languages. But I think that any of the arguments still go through whether it's spoken or written. I think they're the same in a different modality, right?
You ask me?
Bit of signal. And so I sort of intentionally define LLMs narrowly because I thought as soon as you start bringing in other modalities, I think it only makes it easier to defend the proposition because you make them more and more indistinguishable from the kinds of sensors that humans have. But yeah.
Okay.
So this might be follow up, and this is to maybe to Ben. So some people say that you could build in into these systems some sort of grounding by connecting them to like a physics engine. So the argument would be that, okay, well, if I ask it, this to use your example, whether it's easier, what should you use to comb your hair, a hairpin or I don't know, some ridiculous thing. They give stupid responses, LLMs. But if they were hooked up to like a physics engine that would know the weight of the objects and could run like a little simulation of the physical world and then inform the response, and then they wouldn't be caught in
information from vision. So why don't we start with the assumption of multimodality? Because they're all going to be 5, 6, they'll all be multimodal. So I was thinking about this, and some of it sounds like Searle's argument, but it comes down to, I think, the causal theory of reference. So Searle argued it can't have meaning because you don't really ever know the reference. The Chinese room doesn't know the reference. And you say, what's that mean? Well, what it can't mean is the satisfaction of a set of predicates. It has to be a causal theory that is better than just the satisfaction of a set of predicates, because you could have that through vision. It would have to be that you have some kind of causal baptism, causal acquaintance with the object, which by definition, ChatGPT cannot have. So, or whatever. Okay, so I was thinking about this and I think, well, but not everybody believes that. They might think that the meaning consists in knowing the truth conditions or the warranted suitability conditions. And so to know the truth conditions of something, what does that involve? So then I thought, well, if I have a model structure in vision, I say the cat is on the mat. Now I could have, as one of the people I was reading about said, what he thought was what ChatGPT actually does is it is a vast compression of, in fact, the model of the world implicit in the entire corpus that it has. So it's got a model of the world, and that's why the generalizations come out. And so you say, okay, now they've got vision, so it can create a model structure in vision That would be the truth conditions just under vision. So now we say, oh, we've got a model structure in language, in speech. That'll be what the speech sounds like under those conditions, plus the time down to vision. So ultimately, it comes down to, do you have a model structure in haptics? Do you have a model structure in the agency world, the actual causal intercourse with the physical world? That's one notion of what the model structure has to be. The truth conditions have to be causal intercourse with the physical world. Doesn't have that.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to.
That's it.
Yeah.
Finished. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, so long.
No, it was very nice. I really enjoyed it.
Do we clap?
I think it's a really helpful contribution. Yeah, do you want to okay, one for that? Okay.
Marta has something.
And I'm just curious, you have to know the world in order to know what language is, and you need to understand language. Like you have to understand the world too, because that's what it seems like you're saying.
Yeah, but you can do
No,
that.
but that's a different question. It's all it says is, do you understand language? It doesn't if I understand language. So the question is, what are the criteria for understanding language?
Yeah,
Whatever your position.
No, I mean, I think that's what David is trying to characterize, is what are the necessary preconditions? Yeah, I think one set of arguments is it's engagement with the world.
I think it's possible to understand the world through language in part. So language is a not perfectly veridical, but to some extent representative set of information, whether distributionally or propositionally, the things that language communicates are things about the world. As I said, you can reconstruct a lot of the things that humans judge to be true or not true about the world, whether it's how words relate to each other or different perceptual modalities in the words and those perceptual modalities and how they map onto each other from separate consciousness from meaning, right? We do that with other aspects of language. So we do that with part of speech, or like people can agree for the most part that like you can have a syntax parser that doesn't have to be conscious, that can extract like parts of speech. I think if we're going to make progress on this debate, we have to have a sort of like relatively consciousness independent sense of what meaning or understanding is. Because otherwise we're just going to debate the hard problem of consciousness and that might not be tractable. I think the question of emotions is an interesting one, and whether emotions are something that's inherently tied to subjectivity, I don't necessarily have a very good response to. I mean, like I mentioned, there's a lot of evidence that LLMs give behaviors that are consistent with human behaviors, even on these pragmatic phenomena that you mentioned, like sarcasm and humor, right? So LLMs are pretty good at detecting which statements are intended to be humorous. They're even
goes into the training set. It's a long chain, but it's not entirely devoid. And when I for example, I've never seen a blue whale. I only know what a blue whale is, and I think I understand what a blue whale is in virtue of having this like more distant causal chains. I think it's a question of what exactly is the right or the wrong causal chain. Maybe we could stick to that.
Yeah, yeah. So for any given instance, obviously people could have different causal chains, and so what I don't think anyone would want to contend is that every bit of language has to be grounded in the same way with respect to the world. I think your example is a very good and clear one. There are lots of different ways that blue whale is probably grounded for you. You've probably seen images of blue whales, like pictures or illustrations or whatever. You've heard descriptions that use language that is itself grounded much more directly and with a much shorter chain. So blueness You may have even seen a real whale previously. And the descriptors that it's a mammal. Okay, well that's situated in a context in which you've been told what mammals are in relation to things that you know about childbirth and nursing and having hair and whatever, you know, all the things.
And if you talk to any linguist, especially those trained in the 20th century, linguistics, language was syntax. Well, not everybody here in this room, but one thing I've noticed about these large language models is they speak. Okay, you love to use that word. They put out text in perfect syntax. I think that's a surprise. I mean, I think it's a great surprise, and I'm not saying that that's the best criteria for language, but it must have internalized syntax somewhere, which I think is a very important part of language.
Yeah, Terry, that's a great point. And it turns out that when you look at language models as they get bigger or over the course of training, syntax actually comes online much earlier than lots of the more complicated, what we think of as humans as being more complicated, semantic-y, inferential kind of things. So you can be a very small model that's very good at predicting the next word, whether it's is or are, and so on. But still be very bad at these tasks that, you know, of the kind that Sean was demonstrating. So it turns out that syntax, that to the degree that you're right, that linguists only care about syntax or have, they've been actually focusing on the easy part of the problem, because it turns out that you don't have to be born with innate priors for learning language of a particular type in order to get the syntax part right. It turns out that it's all the other stuff that's really interesting and possibly, on my account here, more uniquely used.
Wonderful. Okay, that was great. Last question. So we now move into the closing speeches. So Sean, do you want to close us off first?
Sure. Okay. This is 1 minute, right?
Yes, 1 minute.
Okay, yeah, so just to kind of wrap up where I think the points that have been made in this debate, I think that first of all, understanding is necessarily a very broad topic. And that's why I've tried to kind of adopt a relatively pluralistic take on understanding, and also emphasizing the graded nature of understanding. And I think, in my view, the evidence that we talked about suggests that LLMs do understand language to some extent. Again, whether it's exactly in the same way or to the same extent as humans, I think is up for debate. But the question of whether they understand language at all, I think should be answered in the affirmative. And I also think on the question of like, are they just a parlor trick sort of producing relevant or interesting behaviors? I think scientific debates need to be empirically resolvable in some way, right? So whether it's a parlor trick or not, we don't actually know whether humans understand language other than through our interactions with them and the ways that we probe them for understanding. So unless there's a way that we can probe a language model in a way that we can a human, I don't see why we can't use the same criteria for a language. Okay. Run through that.
Okay. My opponent would have you believe that if it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, then it's a duck. I would contend that not only is that false, because in one case, we are ducks. We know that we are ducks. And therefore the evidence, the behavioral evidence that we quack and walk can be interpreted in the context of us knowing that we are ducks. In other words, we know subjectively that we understand. And so the behavioral evidence that we understand confirms what we already know. With language model, that is not the case. We do not know a priori. We do not have a subjective experience of them understanding. And second, that LLMs do not quack. they fail in all kinds of ways that humans do not fail in language tasks, and I mentioned a couple of them. So on both accounts, a behavioral metric is inappropriate. Instead, we need to start from mechanistic, theoretical understanding of stuff, of what it is that we are trying to define, understanding in this case, and use evidence only as it satisfies and relates to those theoretical constructs. That is all.
Okay, thank you so much to both of our speakers. We now are going to have a final vote so we can see how everyone's minds have changed. So this we're already pretty much out of time. So that's one of my big learnings from today, is that this probably needs to be at least an hour and a half end to end to kind of give us time for everything. But yeah, so obviously we're going to try and have a look at this in about a minute and a half. So if you try and fill this in out quite quickly, there is a section that's kind of like let us know what you thought was kind of a convincing thing and whether you changed your mind. Yeah, well, you're all voting. Yeah, I just want to take a second to say thanks very much to everyone who attended. Yeah, I mean, really, so many of you. Yeah, really appreciate it, and it's made this whole thing a really fun event. Thanks to Tahini for catering, to Doug and Sandy for helping to secure funding for food. So the department funded all the food here. Yeah, we've got the room for like another hour. So if you didn't manage to get any food, is there food left? Yes. Okay. Cool. So you can hang around and grab food, and if there's coffee left and stuff, to make sure we get the most out of that. Thanks to Tan for helping to organise the timings and the room. And thanks to Sarah for sorting out the IT logistics. Thanks especially to our speakers for really getting up here and doing this, because it is a mind-wrapping thing to do in front of your colleagues and your students.
Sean, can you have more questions from other people? Because are you running out of time, or?
Well, we want to finish by 10 too, just in case people need to get away.
Oh.
Yeah. Or do we want to? I mean, I have time. If we want to have.
After we've concluded, I'm happy to chat with anyone about it.
Okay, that sounds lovely. Yeah, because I do think it would be good to have more time for that. Okay, I'm going to take a second away here just to look at the forums and make sure I got everything here. Nice. Okay, people were pretty prompt there. Okay, so wait, I need to do something else. Okay. So these should now be updated. Okay, so this was the initial vote. So about 50% of people said that language models don't understand language. 18.4% said yes, and 30% said maybe. I thought it would be nice to put maybe in there because a lot of people would be unsure. Here's people's self-report of whether they changed their answer. So our speakers did move 25% of people, according to them. So yeah, that's a totally different plot. I should have made that a little clearer. And the final results are so that a similar proportion, I guess fewer maybes, which is good. I should have figured it out in advance how we could quickly hard. No continues to carry the majority, but there's been an increase in the proportion of yes votes.
Also increase in proportion.
True, but a larger increase, I guess, in yes.
So does the color have any significance?
So I think there's a sense here in which everyone won. It's a very strange experience chairing a debate between Sean and Beth. I feel a little bit like Charmander chairing a debate between Charmeleon and Charizard. But yeah, I think the real winner today was science and language models.
ChatGPT didn't hack into Google Forms and get responses, because Sam told me that happened.
I didn't believe that. Okay, so I'm going to finish up here the kind of official event. Thanks everyone for coming. And if you need to rush off, please do. But thanks again for our speakers, and we'll be hanging around for a bit if you want to ask more questions.
And thanks to Cameron for organizing.